quiz on Moodle after this. Hit 1 for 5 points. Let's do that, shall we? And then I'll see you Tuesday. We'll look over chapter 14. Next time, come on. So, sectional conflict. The territory acquired from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Also, the Louisiana Purchase territory. The ways in which their compromises were reached, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. Compromise of 1850, by the way, I forgot to finish discussing. California will enter the Union as a free state. That is the concession given to the North, to the free state, leadership in government. California will enter as a free state. However, there were at the time, I believe, Foner in your textbook, Foner has the exact number, something like 962 black people in California in 1850. About 1/3 of those were slaves. People had brought slaves into California, much like like what they did in Texas before it became a state. Right? California is just this territory. People brought slaves in, and those slaves, because really, it wasn't like, okay, we're a free state now, you have to take your slaves out. There was sort of a fuzzy area there. So there actually were slaves in California, mostly in Southern California. So there's another reason to hate LA. That's a joke. LA is cool. Sectional conflict, though. Basically, you're going to have a series of events which are going to create hostility on both sides, North and South. Free states and the people who are against slavery and slavery's expansion are going to be paranoid and fear the expansion of slavery, not just the continued existence of slavery in the states where it exists, but expansion of slavery. Why? Because slavery does need to expand, right? You need to have more slave states. Otherwise, there are fewer senators, fewer congressional representatives, fewer people in the federal government that are from slave states that are more inclined to support this institution, this form of labor, right? So in the South's mind, there are more radical Republicans who do believe slavery, right? Abolitionists, immediately ending slavery, extending full citizenship to former slaves, in extending the right to vote to African American men. There are Republicans who advocate for that. The Republican Party, which will come into existence in 1854, and most of them are abolitionists. There are also Republicans who are moderate, who believe you can contain slavery where it exists, don't allow it to expand, and then gradually it will change. But either one of those is not a good thing for a lot of Southerners, particularly wealthy, powerful Southerners who control Southern politics, who are representatives in the federal government. Right? Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was a senator from Mississippi, because you imagine you own 20 slaves, 30 slaves, 50 slaves. You've spent $800, $1,200 per slave. That's a massive investment. The number of slaves in 1860, nearly 4 million people, worth as property worth $3 billion in 1860. $3 billion. It's the largest concentration of wealth in the United States, more than all the railroads, all the factories, everything. So a series in which both sides realize that this is something that the founders did not address or attempted to address. It remained legal. It remained in the Constitution, protects slavery in some ways, and this is an issue that is going to come to a head with civil war. First, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where the idea of popular sovereignty. A gentleman named Stephen Douglas, who you see his name down here. Stephen Douglas is a senator. He's going to actually become I forget if it was a re-election campaign. He might have been in the House of Representatives. No, I think he might be a senator. I have to look that up. He is a senator from Illinois. He's actually going to defeat Abraham Lincoln in a Senate race in 1858. And if you want to look at some of the excerpts of their debates, which are considered the like pinnacle of American politics, really, really usher in a modern debate style that we have today. Obviously, not exactly the same as what you're seeing in the Republican primary right now. Lincoln and Douglas did not, or how much makeup they were wearing on stage, right? Because people didn't wear makeup then on stage. There was no television, but very substantive policy, debates about slavery and about whether or not America could be a multiracial, multi-ethnic society, what we call cultural pluralism. Anyways, Stephen Douglas is going to float this idea of popular sovereignty, which says, hey, forget the Mason-Dixon line. Any new territory coming into the United States that wants to apply for statehood, when those folks get together and write a state constitution, let them choose. Let them choose. They get to vote. Let each territory choose whether they want slavery, right? So in essence, slavery has the ability to expand beyond the South, right? Think of all the territory that's not a state yet, that's north, right? You have Oregon, Washington, Idaho, California, which was a state in 1850, but you get my point, right? So in essence, nationalizing slavery, taking it from a situation where, okay, it's this old form of labor that's going out of studies. That's what a lot of people want you to believe. A lot of states' rights people want you to believe. It was going out of favor, that the Confederacy would have gotten rid of slavery on its own, and that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. Popular sovereignty it really goes against that entire idea. It's nationalizing slavery. Another issue that nationalized, so as a result of that, Kansas, which is applying for statehood, people in the Kansas territory are told, okay, you get to choose whether you want slavery based on popular vote, based on, however many people are there. And when you get together and write the Constitution and you elect people, let the people choose. Like Kansas people choose themselves. What ends up happening is a massive migration from a lot of folks from New England, from Massachusetts, who are abolitionists, race to Kansas territory to get there to try to approve a anti-slavery constitution. Simultaneously, you have a bunch of pro-slavery people from the South trying to get into Kansas to push a pro-slavery constitution. Kansas ends up being a free state. Kansas ends up being a free state. There's lots of ins and outs to it, but if you look at a map of the railroads that were in the country, you can see that there were more railroad lines in the north. Hey, they were probably able to get there faster. That's actually probably an element of truth to that. So Kansas enters the Union as a free state. This is the same Kansas, actually, that Topeka is in, which is the home of the Board of Education decision. So Kansas enters the Union as a free state, and 100 years later is actually the centerpiece of a segregation issue. So just because the states didn't have slavery did not mean that they were just hunky-dory to black people and that all the ethnic groups got along wonderfully, right? So that's popular sovereignty, big D, nationalizing slavery, important thing to remember, right? Another thing is the Dred Scott decision. This is important for two reasons, okay? Dred Scott is a slave. A slave travels with, he travels with one master, one owner, to a free state, a northern state. I believe his original owner dies. And then the owner's son inherits him. He's sold. He transfers hands several times. He's in free territory for a number of years. Returns to the South at least once, but he's spent a good chunk of time in free territory. And I believe there's a sale. His owner tries to sell him to somebody, and maybe he didn't want to to this person. He'd been living in free state for a long time. Basically sues for his freedom, arguing, hey, slavery is not legal in this state, right? So I've been here for however many years, I should be considered free. What the Dred Scott decision does is tells him no, he's not free. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a guy named Roger Taney, basically says this is a white man's country, and you should not even be allowed to come to this courtroom and argue anything, right? There are no rights that you have that white people should respect. Basically assigning to African Americans a permanent, you are a slave, you are not a person, you are not a citizen, right? This is ethnic nationalism. This is cultural, this is not cultural pluralism, right? So, and also is saying, think about it, slave owners can take their slaves to free territory, to free states indefinitely. And those slaves are still, those black people are still slaves, right? Regardless of whether they're in a state where slavery is legal. So you think about a state like Missouri, which is a slave state, but right across the river there is Ohio, a free state. You could slave owner that crosses over, I'm sorry, Illinois. I said Ohio, didn't I? Illinois crosses over the Mississippi River, crosses the river into Illinois, right? You buy land in Illinois, a free state. You bring your slaves from Missouri into Illinois to work this other piece of land as slaves. And theoretically, this is, there's not necessarily a huge amount of example, but this is something that's scaring Northerners, right? These are issues that scare Northerners. Yeah. And also, one of the things that upsets Northerners is the Compromise of 1850. They get California as a free state, but the South, in order to appease the South, there is a very robust fugitive slave law passed, which basically compels every Northerner to detain and runaway slaves, right? Where you have federal agents, right? The state, these are the states, slave states that argue for states' rights, and the states have the right to nullify any laws they want. States have the right to secede if they don't like the federal government. These folks are going to actually have the federal government send agents into northern states rounding up slaves, right? Going into free black communities. I dropped my phone. Slaves. To the point where folks in the Underground Railroad, slaves who escape are actually going to have to go to places like Canada. Montreal is a final destination for a lot of them. But you have bounty hunters, not Han Solo. That's in another galaxy far, far away. So various things that are Northerners don't necessarily, in general, believe the equality of black and white, or believe that, some of them are also of the belief that whites are superior. This is a white man's country, blah, blah, blah. They do not like the idea, though, of being basically slave catchers for, these wealthy Southern planters. They resent it. They resent the fact that slavery, which was an institution that's supposed to, slowly die out, is actually attempting to expand. There are more slaves in the country in 1860 than there ever have been. That's the northern fear. The southern fear is that, if these guys get their way and we're contained to the states where we exist, it will eventually die out, right? And not only that, but there's this new political party, the Republicans, which includes members who want to end slavery, and then they want to take your property, right? This property that you've maybe abused, maybe sexually assaulted, and they want to make them equal to you, where they can vote, they can own guns, right? This is terrifying to a lot of people, probably because they feel guilty, because they know what they're doing is not very good. But also poor whites, right? You have poor whites who don't own any slaves, and all of a sudden, they're trying to get a piece of land. Guess what? There's a former slave now who's bidding on that piece of land. He gets the land. Then maybe he tries to marry a white lady. Do you know what I'm saying? Like stuff like that's used to convince poor whites, even though they don't own slaves, it's in their interest to support the system, right? But one of the main things is the Harper's Ferry incident with John Brown. He is pictured here being taken to hang. He was executed. He was executed by the United States government. John Brown is an abolitionist. He actually had 20 children over 2 marriages. Some of those children were his sons who accompanied him to Kansas. He was involved in the Bleeding Kansas conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people. And he decides, God has put me on this planet. People were devoutly religious back then. Many evangelical Christian believed that God had put him on earth to end slavery. This is a white guy from Ohio, right? He's a white guy. He's from the North. Doesn't have it's not like he's fighting for his own freedom or his family's. Yet he sees slavery. He would be described as his actions. He's a religious person. His Christianity tells him to lead an armed uprising in which civilians are going to be killed, probably, right? Terrorism. This is terrorism. The definition of terrorism. He is going to wage war on a civilian population to end slavery, right? And for religious reasons, right? So this is yet he's sort of vindicated by history in that we recognize slavery to be wrong. We recognize that violence that slaves against their masters is just totally justifiable. We sort of recognize that to be justifiable. So the idea that this white guy would take his sons, some supporters, some free blacks from the North, and try to go into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and start this slave uprising, which goes horribly wrong. It doesn't go well. They take some hostages at this armory. It's surrounded. They eventually surrender, and he's put on trial and hanged. Where was I going with that? This guy actually did, there's a huge fear among Southerners. Oh, great. This is different. Not only, there hadn't been a real slave uprising since the Nat Turner Rebellion, also known as the Southampton Uprising, in 1831. That was in Virginia. So it's been 28 years. And now all of a sudden, not only is there this act of terrorism, this militant act, it's actually perpetuated by a Northern white abolitionist, right? Who's actually supported by and funded by abolitionists, many of whom are Republican. Really, it's almost like the not all apples, but all apples are fruits, right? Like not all Republicans are abolitionists, but all abolitionists are Republican. There are no abolitionists who are Democrats. Democrats are, they may have been briefly, but eventually the Republican Party is really going to absorb a lot of the abolitionists, which means they're going to have policies and a platform that are dictated by abolitionists. And they're going to support this guy. Some of them are the more radical elements are going to support this guy, John Brown. The very next year, after 1859, the very next year in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln is nominated by the Republican Party and becomes president, party, which is openly hostile to slavery, which is clearly, some of its members have supported this John Brown guy, they're in control of the federal government. They're in control of the executive branch of the federal government, right? Lincoln doesn't even appear on the ballot in 10 states, at least 10 states. Republicans are in the South, but they carry a lot of Northern support and a lot of support in the West, right? Obviously in the West, because they want to open up the West free of slavery, no wealth. They want to create homesteads, something called, where if people move out there and are willing to work on the land for a number of years, they own it, right? They're also a very pro-business party. So they see Western expansion as good for railroads and mining and all these different business endeavors. So slavery stands in the way of that. So Lincoln, who is elected, in the eyes of Republicans, this is like the end of the world. Think about how a lot of folks felt in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected. I mean, people who were calling him a socialist. They thought that there was going to be a socialist communist revolution in America, right? Some radical, fundamental change in government. Meanwhile, the Treasury Secretary under Obama was a guy named Timothy Geithner, who is from Goldman Sachs, an executive from Goldman Sachs, right? The healthcare reform, Obamacare, which is so radical, is really an old Republican idea. So similarly, Lincoln was a moderate. Lincoln was not a radical. Lincoln would not have freed the slaves had it not been for a civil war that lasted so long. Right? He was a moderate, he was a moderate member of his party, but there's a lot of fear about Republicans in general. Party splits over slavery. They run two or three, they run at least two candidates. Stephen Douglas is a Northern Democrat. There's who else? There's a Bell. There's a Breckinridge. There's a couple of guys. There's who are running for president, saying states' rights, just separate. Let's secede from the Union. Right? Southern pride. There are some folks who are called unionists, kind of like loyalists. Right? They're Southerners. They want to defend slavery. They want to defend their way of life. But they want to remain in the Union. But they split. The Democratic vacuum, that void, is filled by Abraham Lincoln, who becomes president with only 40% of the vote. Right? Because there are multiple candidates, so he's able to become president. So he is elected in November, I believe, on November 6th, 1860. Later, when he takes office, 7 Southern states have formally left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, chosen as their president a senator from Mississippi named Jefferson Davis. Right? And then, so that is in March of 1861. About a month later, these two factions, the North, the United States, basically, what is left of it, most of it, under Abraham Lincoln, and these 7 Southern states, calling themselves the Confederacy, are going to both have militia, have military presence that's going to start fighting each other. On for 4 years, and 700,000 people, roughly, including civilians, are going to die. And we will talk about that on Tuesday. And to conclude the class quiz for side and for the other ones. So that's chapter 13. I hope that was too short. I don't even know. Let me get out of here. Okay, where'd it go? Oh my goodness. I gotta turn it off. Are you still here?